How did American culture come to be what it is today? What will bring a new American Renaissance? Welcome to Session A3 of the New Intellectual Book Study. I'm Cody Leibold. In the title essay in her book For the New Intellectual, Ayn Rand presents her understanding of world history, specifically in terms of the types of men and the types of philosophies that move it. Today we're reading the final third of the essay. This is pages 37 to 57 in the edition that I'm using. So we've seen Ayn Rand's understanding of two archetypical men. There's Attila and the witch doctor. Each has his own incomplete method of understanding the world. And we've seen Rand's understanding of how these two types of men jockeyed for power across world history, often by means of religious ideas or philosophical ideas, even those ideas that we are familiar with from the study of post-Renaissance philosophy from Descartes to Hume. And then on to modern philosophy, starting with Immanuel Kant, leading all the way through Hegel, Marx, John Dewey, and the intellectual disintegration of the 20th and 21st centuries. Now we come to Ayn Rand's analysis of how these patterns have affected the ordinary American and damaged American culture, and we come to her prescription for what is to be done. So it is page 37 in my book. We've just finished her explanation of how the intellectuals were watching the development of capitalism, and they didn't know what to make of it. So she's talking about in the 1800s. The Marxist intellectuals, they were the first to have the ability to be professional intellectuals. And she says that was a great honor because the economy had developed to the point that it could sustain intellectuals, professional intellectuals. And the problem is that they didn't know what to make of what they were seeing with the changes in the Industrial Revolution. And they failed to see the value and the meaning of that Industrial Revolution, specifically because they had already embraced philosophical altruism, and because they did not uphold reason and sound epistemology. So with mysticism and this altruist collectivist mindset, what do you think is going to happen? At the bottom of this page, she writes, the failure of philosophers to challenge the witch doctor's morality had cost them their kingdom, philosophy. The relationship of reason and morality is reciprocal. The man who accepts the role of a sacrificial animal will not achieve the self-confidence necessary to uphold the validity of his mind. We can see this within Christianity now. We can see this within the Van Tillians now, within Big Eva now as well. They are always downplaying two things. They are downplaying the individual's motivation, personal interest, and they are downplaying the individual's mind. So it's his mind and his motivation that are always under attack, and this is the exact same pattern that we're seeing here. So Rand goes on, the man who doubts the validity of his mind will not achieve the self-esteem necessary to uphold the value of his person. See the connection. And to discover the moral premises that make man's value possible. Now, Rand is going to discuss the guilt, and she's discussing it in terms of two groups of men, the intellectuals and the businessmen. She writes, the intellectuals share the philosopher's guilt. So intellectuals, that would be the foot soldiers in the army that is led by the philosophers. The intellectuals share the philosopher's guilt. They knew that they were functioning in a philosophical vacuum. Now, the reading is about 20 pages this week, so I'll be skipping quite a bit. I'm not going to overview all of her main points. She writes very eloquently, and I'm only summarizing bare bones what is the essence of her argument. But by doing this, I was able to see some things that I did not see the first 4 times I read this essay, just to see what is she doing as far as her argument, because she has this way of writing that kind of sweeps you along, and you kind of sometimes forget where she's gone and where she's going. But the outline actually, it revealed some things to me. So she writes, the young minds who came to the field of the intellect with the inarticulate sense of a crusade seeking rational answers to the problem of achieving a meaningful human existence found a philosophical con game in place of guidance and leadership. She's discussing the philosophical minds of the 1800s. Some of them gave up the field of ideas, others gave in. And this seems to be the pattern among thinkers, among businessmen. Either they gave up the pursuit of the intellect, or they just gave in to the trends of what was happening at that time. And she points out that they eventually became pretentious mediocrities. This would refer to the novelists of the 1800s, not just the professional philosophers. This would refer to all of the intellectuals, including the physicists, which we discussed last time. She calls them pretentious mediocrities. She writes, the intellectuals were unable to grasp the historical drama taking place before them, the Industrial Revolution and capitalism. And then on top of 39, the intellectuals did not choose to see. Middle of that page, they remained centuries behind their time, still seeking the favor of noble protectors, some of whom were bewailing the, quote, vulgarity of commercial pursuits, scoffing at those whose wealth was new, and simultaneously blaming these new wealth makers for all of the poverty inherited from the centuries ruled by the owners of nobly, quote, non-commercial wealth. You can see the contradiction there. She writes, the victim of the intellectuals' most infamous injustice was the businessman. So now she discusses the connection between those two groups. I'm at the top of 40. So they did not inquire into the source of wealth or ever ask what made it possible. They had been taught that causality is an illusion and that only the immediate moment is real, as we've seen in the work of David Hume. David Hume, writing in the late 1700s, influenced the intellectuals of the 1800s to believe these things. So, since they had this non-cognitive approach, this non-conceptual approach to philosophy, the intellectuals, she writes, took it as their axiom, as an irreducible primary, that wealth can be acquired only by force, and that a fortune as such is the proof of plunder, with no further distinctions or inquiries necessary, because that's the way it had always been in human history. It was always might makes right. The intellectuals, such as Marx, they watch the developing wealth in the 1800s, and they think, well, that's power, that's wealth, therefore it must have come from some infelicitous method. It's just a quick assumption, because they haven't bothered to analyze what actually happened. Where did this wealth come from of the Industrial Revolution? Rand writes, if the men who produced the wealth were thieves, from whom had they stolen it? Someone like Marx comes into the scene and says that property is theft, that profits are wages stolen from the workers. It's the value has been stolen from one person and given to another. They don't recognize that under capitalism, in an industrial economy, we create more than was ever created before. That doesn't mean it was taken from one person and given to another. It just means more was created. And who owns what was created? The person who organized the process. The person who laid out the funds in the first place. The capital. So Rand writes, they were refusing to acknowledge the Industrial Revolution. They are still refusing today. They were refusing to admit into their universe what neither Attila nor the witch doctor can afford to admit, the existence of man the producer. So this was the failure of the intellectuals. This is the failure of Karl Marx. I'll stop there and ask any comments. Anyone wants to jump in, comment on any of that or the connections to what we see today? Go ahead, Greg.
You know, it's kind of funny because I remember watching a documentary about a politician around the 1900s, and he had a famous saying. He said that nobody makes $1 million in an honest way. And of course, then that begs the question, who did the farmer steal the apples from? And you have your own Brooke who gives the answer to that. He says, when J.K. Rowling wrote Harry Potter and ended up becoming a billionaire, who did she steal that money from? No one. We all went out, spent our $10 and bought Harry Potter. And our lives are better for it. And, her life was better for it. So it's a mutual exchange. It's, it was a win-win situation.
Yeah, and it was done voluntarily. That's part of it, is if people are paying in order to have this experience and you're able to give them and they want to give you the money, who's to say that you didn't create that value? They independently judged that it was worth that value. Any other interactions?
Yeah, I think the common misconception is that wealth disparity is fundamentally an issue. And what I've been trying to explain to my congregation when we talk about economic issues is that Scripture is very much concerned with poverty. And by poverty, I believe biblically defined, it's those who are truly lacking those things they need. What God does not seem to have a problem with is some person having more than others. We can have an entire society in which half of society, half of the populace is trillionaires and the other half are millionaires. There's no one poor there, but yet there is great wealth disparity. That's I think a fundamental distinction that too many people fail to make, and often they just baptize that Marxist view of property into any biblical verse regarding the poor, and it's an unfortunate shell game.
I agree. Poor relative to incredible wealth is not the same thing as being in poverty. There's a book from Yaron Brook called Equal is Unfair, and it questions that premise. It's worth looking at that book. All right, let's go to the bottom of 40. So it talks about how they evaded the difference between production and looting. They called the businessmen robbers. Evading the difference between freedom and compulsion, they called him a slave driver. Evading the difference between reward and terror, they called him an exploiter. Evading the difference between paychecks and guns, they called him an autocrat. Evading the difference between trade and force, they called him a tyrant. The most crucial issue that they had to evade was the difference between the earned and the unearned. Now, Rand eventually is going to get us to why. Why would they make these mistakes? What was their motivation? What was driving them? I think you'll see it's fascinating. But first she needs to lay out what did they do. We'll get to the why in a while. The what is that they refused to identify the fact that industrial wealth was the product of man's mind, says Rand. They could not afford to identify it because they could not afford to admit the fact that the intellect is a practical faculty. Since they have not built an epistemology that ties their observations to their concepts, they also are going to be lacking an understanding of moral concepts and how the moral is the practical. This is a common theme we always see in Rand. Since they don't know that the moral is the practical, they don't go looking for an explanation that is reality-oriented for how this wealth has come about. So they don't know that the intellect has the task of the study of reality, because they are thinking platonically, they're thinking mystically. And Rand says, not the contemplation of unintelligible feelings, nor a special monopoly on the unknowable. As oriented as they were to the unknowable and to their whatever non-observational type concepts that they could come up with, eventually they were going to not be able to connect the cause and effect that they see happening around them. Top of 41, the witch doctor's morality of altruism. This is his driver. His morality of altruism, the morality that damns those who achieve success or enjoyment on earth, provided the intellectuals with the means to make a virtue of evasion. And we'll see how this works. So first, she says, it gave them a weapon that disarmed their victims. It gave them an automatic substitute for self-esteem and a chance at an unearned moral stature. So they're going to go around proclaiming the righteousness of altruism and collectivism. And it gives them an unearned moral stature because everybody thinks, well, these people must understand something I don't. There's something about this pathological altruism message that sounds unearthly. Maybe that's from a higher realm. So they proclaimed themselves to be the defenders of the poor against the rich, righteously evading the fact that the rich were not Attilas any longer. So anybody that goes around saying, oh, the rich are oppressing the poor, you can see this in society today. It immediately gives you a sense of credibility because you're concerned about the plight of these victims. You're on the side of the David, not the Goliath. And so they were grievance hustlers, just as we have today. Middle of page 41, the businessman was bewildered by the events as the rest of mankind. He had no time to grasp his own historic role. Knowing no morality but the altruist code, yet knowing also that he was functioning against it, that self-sacrifice was not his role, he was helplessly vulnerable to the intellectual's attack. You see this today as well. And then there's a couple of sections here that Rand is now going to get to her argument of how they pulled the wool over everybody's eyes. What did the intellectuals of the 1800s actually do? So in my book, I wrote section A. It's going to be an extended argument, so sort of clear out the cache in your mind, get ready for the extended argument. Section A. To understand the course that the intellectuals chose to take, remember the witch doctor's psychoepistemology and his relationship to Attila. The witch doctor expects Attila to be his protector against reality, against the necessity of rational cognition. And at the same time, he expects to rule his own protector. He expects to rule Attila. Because Attila needs an unintelligible mystic sanction as a narcotic to relieve his chronic guilt. So that's their relationship. So now they derive their mutual security not from any form of strength, but from the fact that each has a hold on each other's secret weakness. For more details, see the last two videos we did. Okay, now this is section B in her argument. The witch doctor feels like a metaphysical outcast in a capitalist society. If you've studied the thought of Marx and the other socialists that Rand describes as meeting in sidewalk cafes and salons, these intellectuals, they had this aversion to what was happening around them. They felt like outcasts. Why? Well, because they had no means to deal with innocence, writes Rand. So the world was now being managed and built by businessmen, not by kings and tyrants. So the businessman, he's confident in his ability to earn a living. He takes pride in his work. He has no sense of needing the witch doctor. Rand writes what the businessmen offered to the intellectuals would have been the freedom of the marketplace of ideas. Oh yeah, you have good ideas? Then sell them. But this was not the witch doctor's mode of functioning. This was not the witch doctor's means of making a living. He was not used to the idea of having to demonstrate the truth of his ideas and market them. The businessmen would have dealt with the witch doctors on the level of rational, voluntary choice. You're free to live by the work of your mind. That's fine. But that would be something that people functioning on the conceptual level could do. And Rand writes, that's only something that a rational psychoepistemology would be able to welcome. She writes, it is not the place for the witch doctor nor any mystic to do that kind of thing. A witch doctor has to live by the favor of a protector. And this was his historical role. He was, say, like in the Mayan civilization or Aztecs, you can imagine there's the king, and then there's next to him, there's the priest. And the priest is the one telling them, this is the way of our people. We collect the sacrifices. Well, who actually goes and collects them? The king does. But the king is doing what the witch doctor says. The witch doctor is used to having this position, being propped up by the king, and now he doesn't have anyone propping him up. No one telling the society that this is the way of our people. So he's no longer able to rule the minds of the populace by force, which is the way he survived. And Rand points out it was always by special dispensation, by a reserve monopoly, an exclusion, a suppression, a censorship, something like that, historically. That was how the intellectuals ruled. You can see that in the history of the Catholic Church as well. The relationship between the kings of Europe and the Catholic leadership. Same relationship. All right, so that is section B in her argument. Now let's go on to section C. Having accepted the philosophy and the psychoepistemology of the witch doctor, the intellectuals had to cut the ground from under their own feet. They had to reject their historical position of being professional intellectuals. They said, no, we don't want to be professional intellectuals. We want to call for a new tyranny. Why? Because that will set us up again in our customary place where we can be the ones telling the tyrants what to do. Instead of accepting the ability to be self-standing men of the mind, professional intellectuals, selling their ideas, they said, we are going to call for a new tyranny. What they were rebelling against was the open market of ideas, writes Rand, where feelings were not accepted and ideas were expected to demonstrate their validity. Which leads us to section D in Rand's argument. Just as Attila, since the Renaissance, was looking for a witch doctor, so the intellectuals, since the Industrial Revolution, were looking for an Attila of their own. The altruist morality brought them together and gave them the weapon they needed, and the field they found each other was socialism. When they realized the need for an Attila, they said, we could proclaim the need for socialism. Since we need socialism, we'll be the witch doctors whispering in the ears of the Attilas, and it will be establishing socialism. So now, in this next section, Rand doesn't explicitly say so, but she provides us with the means, the motive, and the opportunity of a great historical crime. So she describes the means. She says that throughout the 19th century, originating in intellectual salons, sidewalk cafes, basement beer joints, university classrooms, the industrial counter-revolution united the witch doctors and the Attilaists. That was their means. Now she describes their motive. They demanded the right to enforce ideas at the point of a gun. That is, through the power of government and to compel the submission of others to the views and wishes of those who would gain control of the government's machinery. And here is finally the opportunity. They extolled the state as the form of the good. That was, say if you've ever read Hegel, and if you've ever read Marx, the form of the good was the state. That was their gimmick, their gambit. So they declared the need for a socialist state. Means, motive, and opportunity. The crime of the century. Now, what this meant in practice, if they were to actually get what they were asking for, would be the same witch doctor cannibalistic morality that we've seen throughout history, but now applied in a modern society. Rand writes, the cannibal essence remained the same. Socialism is the doctrine that man has no right to exist for his own sake, that his life and his work do not belong to him. It's a key definition here. It belongs to society, that the only justification for his existence is his service to society, and that society may dispose of him in any way it pleases for the sake of whatever it deems to be his own tribal collective good. This is just the old witch doctor morality. Now, that's the meaning. What are the consequences? Rand points out that it had to lead in practice to a torrent of blood and brute non-human horrors such as socialist societies as Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia. Those are the necessary results of that moral system. And today, everybody that wants to enter into the realm of politics seems to be imitating the assumptions of those same parties, but now promising that their own gang is going to do it better. And they mumble in a quavering voice about the past socialists. Oh, well, they did it for the love of humanity or for good motives. And Rand points out that the pretenses are wearing thin among the intellectuals today. And I would mention that Jordan Peterson is good on that topic. He said, well, people ask him, how do you know that Marxism is a murderous ideology? Well, he says, you look at the body count. That's the consequences. Okay, interactions before we move into the next section. That completes the arc of Rand's major argument about the motivation of the witch doctors today.
This quote here about, socialism, the doctrine that man does not have the right to live for his own sake. We see this even in conservative circles. And even though we might not have it quite as explicitly, we still see it. And like one example I've seen is when people talk about performing abortions on people with Down syndrome, to kill the baby who has Down syndrome. I've heard people say, well, this person with Down syndrome might be able to create value in the lives of many other people, as many people with Down syndrome do. And while that it's true, that's not why this person has value. This person has, within themselves the right to live. They have the God-given right to live. And this is a person who has value within themselves, regardless of, how much good they end up doing in their lives for others.
Well, that's well said. And, people might look at that situation and say, well, this person is very unlikely to be able to have their own career where they sustain themselves without outside help. Is that their argument? That, okay, so therefore society has the need to kill that person, or this family has the moral right to kill that person because it would be extra work for them to be moms and dads? And as a parent, I know that whenever you decide that you're going to have a child, you take an enormous risk. There's a significant possibility that you're going to have a child that has some extra needs beyond just the overwhelming amount of needs that every child has. You decide when you have a child that you're going to be in a committed relationship with a person for decades, perhaps even their entire life if they have a special need. But do they have a right? Once they come into existence, do they have a right? And we would say, yes, they do. Sadly, Ayn Rand and the Objectivists do not understand the reason why abortion is wrong. They get this issue completely wrong. Go ahead, Greg.
Yeah, just one more thing I'll throw out there real quick is, I'd say the individual rights begin at individuality. And I'm half stealing from a conversation you and I had, Cody, years ago, where you told me, hey, there is a secular argument against abortion. And I was skeptical and you laid it out for me. I don't remember exactly how you put it, but, since that time I've realized, like, hey, if we're going to talk about individual rights, the individual starts at conception. That's a unique individual with a unique genetic code. And if you're going to say that individual rights do not begin there, then when does an individual begin? When does an individual life begin? Is it 28 days after they're born, like we're seeing out in California? Or is it, 6 months after conception? When is it? When do those rights actually begin, if not at individuality?
And if they're going to argue that way, they also have to argue in terms of some kind of, like, what is the living being capable of doing? And then it becomes a argument about what can that living being contribute? And it becomes a collectivist premise. Interesting. I hadn't really thought about the connection between pro-abortion policy and collectivism, at least in that way. I had thought about it in terms of there are people that say, let's help the black community by providing abortions to the black community. That's definitely a collectivist argument. So Rand is describing what happened in the intellectual life in America. She writes that the intellectuals are aware of their guilt, but they are still struggling to evade its cause and to pass it on to the universe at large, to man's metaphysical, predestined impotence. So this is something that we see in conservatives often talk about, the need for collectivism, not because humanity is so good, but because humanity is so bad. And it's odd because you get the liberals arguing humanity is perfectible and therefore we need collectivism. Conservatives argue humanity is not perfectible and therefore we need collectivism. So Rand points out today's American culture is being splintered into disintegration by the three injunctions which permeate our intellectual atmosphere and which are typical of guilt. Don't look, don't judge, don't be certain. That is the intellectual life of our country. In other words, she writes, don't integrate, don't evaluate, give up. Now, she's going to have a section here describing what she calls Attilaism. This is the outlook that starts with skepticism that you cannot really have concepts grounded in reality. The David Hume mindset. Remember, she called David Hume Attilaist. She writes, Attilaism in philosophy, it means that integration is impossible. It means that your concepts cannot be tied to reality and they can't integrate to each other. If Attilaism were true, no datum can ever be related to other data. It would mean that context is irrelevant. Anything can be proved or disproved in midair and midstream. System building would therefore be out. It would be the major error that you could commit intellectually. System building is the integration of knowledge into a coherent sum and a consistent view of reality. The Attilaist denounce system building. So Rand points out there are implications to that. Science was born as a result of and a consequence of philosophy. It cannot survive without a philosophical and particularly epistemological base. If philosophy perishes, science will be the next to go. So that's one of the consequences that we see in America today. Rand points out that the abdication of philosophy is all but complete. Today's philosophers, qua witch doctors, declare that nobody can define what is philosophy or what its specific task is, but this need not prevent anyone from practicing it as a profession. But then qua Attilaists, they declare that the use of wide abstractions and concepts is the prerogative of the layman, or of the ignorant man on the street. But the philosopher is one who, knowing all the difficulties involved in the problem of abstractions, deals with nothing but concretes. So if you think about the linguistic analysis school of philosophy today, they want to say that philosophy is a legitimate career, but it involves mostly talking about the meaning of words, not what actually is true. They don't have a metaphysical approach. They don't have an ability to interact on metaphysical or ethical topics as much as just on the grammar. All of this amounts to an injunction, don't be certain and don't judge. The skepticism or the lack of being certain about things, that is the core of American intellectual life today. And Rand points out the injunction, don't judge, is the ultimate climax of the altruist morality. There is a connection there. When they react with the instantaneous compassion to any guilt, to the perpetrators of any atrocity, while turning away indifferently from the bleeding bodies of the victims and the innocent, one may see the actual purpose, motive, and psychological appeal of the altruist code. So she is indicting the intellectuals of the last 200 years and pointing out that they do not care about what is good for individual people. They want an excuse to not have to judge because they want to be off the hook. She writes, perhaps the most craven attitude of all is the one expressed by the injunction, don't be certain. It's a suggestion, she says, that if nobody is certain of anything, and if nobody holds any firm convictions, then no one's going to rise and be the next dictator. And she points out that psychologically, this approach, this lack of certainty approach, you might see it in the New York Times, the writer David Brooks today, those who defend moderation in principle, so to speak. They think that the problems in society happen when someone is strong and certain. And so they think that the solution is to remove certainty from society. And Rand points out that this is pretty laughable because actually the tyrants of history have always been the kind of people that would immediately run away, just like any bully would run away from somebody that is certain and that says you're wrong. But these David Brooks types, they think of the tyrants as being strong. They're actually not. So it says more about them than it does about the world. Bottom of that page. Now she's discussing how this paved the way for the Attilaists. The intellectuals paving the way for Attila are still repeating, not by conviction any longer, but by rote, the growth of government power is not an abridgment of freedom, that the demand of one group for an unearned share of another's income is not socialism, that the destruction of property rights will not affect any other rights. By the way, does that sound like the National Conservatives under Yoram Hazony? Those 3 points there, those are consistent with everything I've heard within their platform. Growth of government power is not an abridgment of freedom. That's one of their mistakes. Demand for one group of unearned share of another group's income is not socialism. That's another of their mistakes. And then the destruction of property rights will not affect any other rights. That's another one of their mistakes. All right, well, top of 46. Here I agree with Rand very strongly. She says that if America perishes, it will perish by intellectual default. But I have a question about what she says next. She says there is no diabolical conspiracy to destroy America. No conspiracy could be big enough and strong enough. Perhaps in the 1960s she was right. I don't know. I don't know whether there are conspiracies like from the World Economic Forum. But it's pretty clear that there are groups of people today that are conspiring. It's just a question of what's the relative role of those people versus just the conspiracy of premises. Jacob Brunton and I have discussed the conspiracy of premises concept that Rand brings up, which is just that if everybody believes collectivism, we're all going to drift in that direction. Even if nobody is particularly capable of forcing us to, we're going to. Comments before we move to the next part?
Real quick, I think she goes on to say there are, a few conspirators here and there, like a pickpocket who finds himself in an open mansion with all the security down, and then he doesn't know what to do with himself. Right. So, and I think you're right. To your point, today there are more sophisticated conspirators. They're not just pickpockets anymore. They've gotten better. They learned back in the 60s in Rand's day. They started off as pickpockets, but they learned that that there's a bigger haul to be had here than what I realized, and so they've spent potentially decades honing their craft of conspiratorialism. And so they've gotten better, but I think it's important to point out, and I think this is her point, that they would not be possible, and they absolutely wouldn't have any chance of succeeding apart from the default that she's talking about. And I think that's the important point to take from this.
Thank you for that. Rand writes, we are moving toward full totalitarian socialism, with worn, cynical voices telling us that such is the irresistible trend of history. We are moved by nothing but the sluggish inertia of unfocused minds, she says. Okay, so she's discussed the guilt of the intellectuals. Now she has a shorter section on the guilt of the businessmen. She writes, no injustice or exploitation can succeed for long without the sanction of the victim. This is another one of Rand's key conceptual frameworks, is this idea of the sanction of the victim. Think of Henry Reardon in Atlas Shrugged, accidentally giving his moral sanction to those who were his destroyers. And of course, Henry Reardon is the businessman. Rand writes, the businessman made the fatal error when he conceded to the witch doctors the field of the intellect. He gave them the benefit of the doubt at his own expense. He concluded that their meaningless verbiage could not be as bad as it sounded to him. I'm sure when she wrote this that she had Henry Reardon in mind. So by becoming anti-intellectual, the businessman condemned himself to the position of an Attila. Because the world that the intellectuals were trying to create was, we'll create a world where anybody that has power is an Attila. And we're going to call anybody that has power an Attila. And he accepted that. So then, because he was put into this position of the Attila, he had to restrict his interests to Attila's narrow range of the physical, the material, the immediately present. Now, the businessmen typically, at least early on, did not embrace the altruist morality. If you look at the history of the so-called robber barons, I mean, like Rockefeller, Carnegie, J.P. Morgan, and I forget, there's a whole bunch of them. Typically, they started out their life trying to build something. And then at the end of their life, they accepted the morality of altruism and became very guilty and spent the rest of their decades giving away their money. I'm not sure if Morgan, but the others did. She says that they didn't start out as accepting this moral philosophy, but they started out by just not worrying about an interest in ideas. She says that he could not accept the altruist morality as no man of self-esteem can accept it, and he found no other moral philosophy. He lived by a subjective code of his own, therefore. He didn't think that there's universal truths, but he thought, personally, I want to be a man of justice. This would be the typical pattern. So he thought he had his own code of right and wrong, and he would just follow it. He thought he needed to be a fair trader, but he didn't realize that it was a superlative virtue. He just thought, this is the way I want to be. He didn't apply it to other people and his judgments of other people. He didn't judge other people for not being like him in that way. And so, if you read Atlas Shrugged, it's the story of the producers not realizing the value of their own outlook on life, and then coming to terms with it, being confronted by it. So Rand writes, benevolent generosity. She describes the benevolent generosity of these businessmen. They had the benevolent generosity of a self-confident man who is too innocent to suspect that he is hated for his success. That the moralists of altruism want him to pay financial tributes not as a kindness, but as an atonement for the guilt of having succeeded. Once they realize that that is what's going on, then they will stop donating to liberal colleges. They'll stop giving credibility and money to their own destroyers. All right, top of 48. Any comments before we go to the next section? Go ahead, Greg.
So yeah, earlier you mentioned this postmodernism and how it's basically going to become the death of science, and it just kind of amazes me. I look around and it seems like we have this narrative that everyone can create their own reality, but don't you dare challenge the science. People can believe whatever you want. What's true for you is true for you. What's true for me is true for me. But don't you dare question climate change or whatever the cause of the day happens to be. And I do have a question. We talk about the bullies that they would. Do you think the bullies would run away? If people stood up, if people started standing up to all of this, would the bullies run away, as Rand seems to say?
You'd have to take it on a case-by-case basis. Like, one instance would be the White House press secretary. Even if one journalist asks them an annoying question with a sense of insistence and confidence, they completely embarrass themselves publicly. It's like watching a beginning teacher in a group of 8th grade students watching the class get out of control. It's hilarious. So, that's one example of even it just takes one person with a spine. It's hard to say, though. What other examples do you have in mind of that question?
I'm not sure. It's like, I think we just look around at the society and you see this postmodern extremism, of, agree with this prevailing philosophy or else. And it just seems like it's all over the place. It's almost like we're fish and this is water.
Well, the section that Rand was describing, this trend of people believing that the solution to bullyism is everybody saying, I'm not certain of things. I think her point there is that it just says something bad about the character of these people that try to be moderate on principle. It's not to say that 100 men with spines would immediately begin to fix the world. Although I think that if there were even like 5 seminary professors at Southern Seminary that had spines, they would fix Southern Seminary. Those are the kinds of things that I think are true. So, talking again about the businessmen, they accepted the burden of an unearned guilt. They accepted the brand of vulgar materialists. They accepted the accusation of predatory greed, predatory toward the wealth that they had created. Greed for the fortunes which but for them would not have existed. As a result, consciously or unconsciously, subconsciously, they were driven to the cynical bitterness of the conviction that men are irrational, that reason is impotent in human relationships, that the field of ideas is some dark, gigantic, incomprehensible fraud. And I think that, that's the consequence psychologically. If you don't identify what it is that you're seeing, eventually you get to the conclusion that the world doesn't make sense. Now, she describes men motivated by chronic fear, working to appease their worst enemies, pouring money into the support of leftist publications. So this is true. Colleges get their money from businesses. by and large. The businessmen will make speeches about how they believe in selfless service to humanity, and they talk about altruistic apologies for the fact that they still keep 2 or 3% of the profit of their multi-million-dollar enterprises. It's pathetic. They feel like they have to apologize for what they've accomplished. Yeah, Ryan.
Yeah, this is just very familiar to me regarding these businessmen who experience unearned guilt simply for having succeeded in their endeavors. I have a friend who lives near D.C. and manages the finances of a very large nonprofit, I believe helping immigrant girls, and he speaks about his frustrations in that industry, where he'll have to scrape cash and beg and plead to have a few bucks to buy lunch for one of their clients, and yet his bosses will go take a $200 lunch at a local restaurant. And he says, when I talk to him about this pathological altruism, as you call it, he laughs and says, I see it all the time. Our real clients are not these young girls. Our real clients are the donors for whom we are providing guilt absolution. That's our real function. That's the real business model, is making sure that the reports are good, trying to prove to them that we are doing good with your money. Don't worry about it. You don't actually have to get involved. Just keep paying your fees, your indulgences, so to speak. And then they feel better for having been successful because they're doing something good with it. And it sort of goes back to the morality of self-sacrifice. I'm giving up something. It doesn't matter if it's doing good, but I'm giving it up, and therefore I feel better about it. And that's the real business they're in, is his complaint. And that echoes exactly what she's saying here.
Yeah, that's pretty sad. I think that when people begin to understand how these ideas interplay, I think that there will be a lot of people that are in good types of line of work, charitable lines of work, for instance, or just in business, that are going to have such a different outlook. I remember you mentioned that even some people that you know personally had been quite relieved by realizing that this was sort of a game that's being played and that they were being made to feel guilty. Did you want to share anything about that, Ryan?
Sure, yeah. Just was preaching through the book of James, and because in chapter 5, there is a passage in which he pronounces woes upon the rich, those who are, I believe, outside the church, unbelievers, who are withholding wages by fraud, and questions naturally arose as to, well, what is this? Anyone who has more than someone else, anyone we would call rich, or who is this? And I explained some of the historical context of, no, there was actually an elite class essentially in Jerusalem that used the power of the Jewish religion and the temple to systematically oppress in a very literal way the lower class in Judea. And in explaining that and showing that many of the places in Scripture where Jesus speaks about the poor, and seems to use poor interchangeably with the righteous, and the rich with unrighteous. They were often living in a society in which most believers were poor, and most of the oppressors were rich, or were unbelievers, and so just explaining that those historical circumstances actually fit. They were speaking accurately, not proverbially. And so I just had several wealthy entrepreneurs who were faithful, very generous people tell me later that this was incredibly relieving to them to recognize that just the mere possession of wealth through nothing but, should we say, well-gotten gains was not something to be embarrassed or ashamed of, and it was quite liberating for them emotionally, just simply because there was this nagging, unexamined, I would say low-grade fear that I think is normal life for most evangelicals.
The sad is that these people have worked hard for decades, and if they're wealthy, they're probably in their 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and all of that time, they had that feeling building. Well, let's go in the middle of this, or in the bottom of page 48. Rand summarizes that most businessmen have probably given up the expectation of any justice from the public. I mean, how disheartening is that? Top of the next page. Today, businessmen and the intellectual face each other with the mutual fear and the mutual contempt of Attila and the witch doctor. The businessman is not daring to look at the future because they don't know what the landscape is going to be in the future. The Attila doesn't dare to look in the past because that would require him to make cause and effect conclusions. Sort of a poetic way of describing the intellectual faults of the businessmen and of the intellectuals. One doesn't look to the future and realize the need for concepts to understand how to get to the future. Then the other doesn't look at the past and understand his job is to pull from the past and show us what concepts we need. So, the businessman considers the intellectual impractical. The intellectual considers the businessman immoral. Exactly the relationship we saw with the Attila and the witch doctor before. Secretly, each of them believes the other possesses a mysterious faculty that he lacks. The other is the true master of reality, the true exponent of the power to deal with existence. And they are destroying each other. Bottom of this page, what ends up happening is that intellectuals are proclaiming that all the disasters of the modern age are man's punishment for the pride of relying on his intellect, for the attempt to improve his condition, to establish a rational society, and to achieve a perfect way of life on earth. And she gives this anecdote about how the conservatives and the liberals in her day would both agree that you can't really perfect man's life on earth. But the liberals of her day said, well, we can at least improve it a little. And the conservatives said, no, we don't believe you can improve it at all. They bring in the concept of original sin, which I don't think is an accurate application of that concept. I just make a connection here to the National Conservatives again. I just point out that the National Conservatives are strongly opposed. Like, for example, Yoram Hazony is strongly opposed to the idea that we can make a perfect society. And I think it's a straw man when he talks to Yaron Brook. Hazony says, you think that you can make a perfect society using your intellect. And that's where I disagree with you. And I think that that's not a good representation of what objectivism wants to do. Rand will speak of a perfect society or of perfecting society, but we actually all agree that we need to make a better society. We need to reform it, that there is a direction that it should go. And so I think that the trouble with the National Conservatives is that they are not confident that there is a direction that we can know using our minds. And that is the dividing point between national conservatism and, say, objectivism, as represented by Ayn Rand and Yaron Brook. The objectivists believe that we can know universally applicable ideas about justice and about what the government should do and what it shouldn't do. And I don't know, to some degree I think there's some talking past each other. I've been reading Hazony's book, and I think that he makes some fair and some fine points, and I think he's exaggerated some of the differences between him and, say, John Locke or him and Ayn Rand. I don't think he understands their vision. But where we do disagree, where Hazony is wrong, is on the question of whether or not human society can be understood in terms of universal moral principles that ought to apply, and whether we can understand those by reason. Whether we can get from the what, whether we can reason from the is to the ought. He would disagree, as what he calls a historical empiricist. He would disagree that you can get to the ought just by human reason. And because of that, he's morally skeptical about whether or not you can really have knowledge. So he therefore relies on tradition. And therefore he will not follow John Locke. He will not follow Thomas Jefferson in understanding what a government is and what it's for. Well, we're on the top of 50. Rand describes this such as the bankruptcy of a culture. And now we get to the concluding section of her essay. She has taken all of this time, and we've done hours of discussion now on what she's said. She's taken all this time to show us how society got where it is. Now, how to get out of it? You just have to ask yourself, how did we get into this problem in the first place? And that will tell us where we should fix the problem. Rand says, who are the new intellectuals? Any man or woman who is willing to think. All those who know that man's life must be guided by reason. If you know that man's life must be guided by reason, that is our means of knowledge, and if you're willing to do the work to think about what is justice, you can analyze, you can use the tools that you have. That will make you a new intellectual. So Rand writes that America is the country based on the premise of man's self-reliance, self-esteem. And she writes that Americans have known how to erect a superlative material achievement, but what we need now is to build a corresponding philosophical structure. And without that philosophical structure, the material blessings that we have in America will not survive. So I'd recommend our Objectivism book study, and I'd recommend the book Objectivism, The Philosophy of Ayn Rand by Peikoff, to see what that philosophical structure is. Rand had not written that or created that material yet, but that philosophical structure does exist. We're not just hoping for it. It exists. All right, so Rand says, to support a culture, nothing less than a new philosophical foundation will do. Yes, and we have it. The present state of the world is not proof of philosophy's impotence, but the proof of philosophy's power. And Rand writes, it is philosophy that has brought men to this state. It is only philosophy that can lead them out. Now, philosophy taken very broadly, which would include correct theology. Truth, true ideas will lead us out of the mess that we are in. I don't think that's really anything that we could doubt. So Rand writes, those who could become the new intellectuals, they are scattered, they are silent, they're helpless throughout our country. The new intellectuals will be those men who come out into the open and have the courage to break the vicious cycle of silence and being lost in a fog. So nobody dares to take the first new step, writes Rand. Everybody waits for his neighbor's initiative. She writes, the greatest need today is for men who are not strangers to reality because they're not afraid of thought. The new intellectuals will be those who will take the initiative and the responsibility. They will check their own philosophical premises, identify their convictions, integrate their ideas into coherence and consistency, and then offer the country a view of existence to which the wise and honest can repair. By the way, that is what we do at ChristianIntellectual.com. And that's why, anybody that watches this in the future, I would ask you, please consider supporting what we are doing at ChristianIntellectual.com, because we looked at what Rand wrote in this essay, and we said we want to create a website and a podcast. We're going to call it For the New Christian Intellectual, based on this essay, because we wanted to be those people who would have the courage to come out into the open and to break that cycle of silence. We wanted to be the kind of people that would not wait for somebody else's initiative, but would create an initiative. And so that's what we're doing. That's something worth supporting. Rand writes, the new intellectual will be the man who lives up to the exact meaning of his title. He's guided by his intellect. It's a moral thing to be guided by your intellect. We're not talking about having high IQ. We're talking about a moral decision that you will be guided by your intellect. Not a zombie guided by feelings, instincts, urges, wishes, whims, or revelations. To be a new intellectual means to be oriented toward reality by means of your method, which is reason. So then he can, as we talked about in Objectivism in the book study, he's going to be able to discard his irrational conflicts, contradictions, such as mind versus heart, thought versus action, reality versus desire, practical versus moral. He'll be an integrated man, and that's what we achieved when we did the Objectivism book study, is showing how you can be an integrated man. He'll be a thinker who is a man of action. He will know that ideas divorced from consequent action are fraudulent. The action divorced from ideas is suicidal. And then Rand summarizes, he will know that men need philosophy for the purpose of living on earth. That's our message for the New Christian Intellectual. Men need philosophy for the purpose of living on earth. We believe in rational Christianity for those who love their lives. That's what we talk about all the time. So going on to the next page, we're on the bottom of page 52. Rand now begins to explain some of the practical means that she thinks that people could build this Reformation movement, this new Renaissance in America. And her idea is that businessmen and intellectuals need to do a cultural exchange program. And I think that can be applied even to the church. If you think about it, pastors are, in a way, they're kind of like the businessmen of the church. Pastors are like the businessmen because very often they are drifting intellectually. And they're the ones that are in charge of the enterprise of Christianity in the world. They are very often capable of doing the numbers. They're capable of creating a product. And I'm not saying we should think about church as a business, but pastors are, in a way, there's some parallels between pastors and businessmen. And what people like myself and Jacob Brunton are trying to do is to come alongside them and say, pastors, you need to awaken to the life of the intellect. You need to awaken to the reality that philosophy is shaping your theology. And so I think that you could even apply what Rand has said here about this program, this exchange program. We could substitute the pastors into that. And we could say the pastors need intellectuals who will come beside them and help them. So that's something that we should consider. That's when we write books. We should write books for pastors. Pastor, here's how you talk about politics. Pastor, here's how you teach men to raise their sons, and you do it in a way that is principled, biblical, and also logical and rational. These are the kinds of things that we need to be creating as intellectuals. All right, we go to the next section here. Rand is going to just briefly mention the role of capitalism in America. She has an entire book on this subject. It's called Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal. And in this paragraph, she summarizes the entire content of that book. She says, let these businessmen and these philosophers discover the nature and the theory and the actual history of capitalism. Because no other subject is hidden by so many distortions, misconceptions, misrepresentations, falsifications. She says the evils that are ascribed to capitalism, they didn't come from capitalism. So there's a good paragraph there summarizing her thoughts on capitalism and its importance. And then she goes on in this next section. She says the Founding Fathers were America's first intellectuals and so far, her last. She says that today the witch doctors claim that the basic premise of the Founding Fathers was faith. And they claim that it was an uncritical compliance with tradition. Where have we heard that? Today's Attilaists claim that the basic premise was the subordination of the individual to the collective. Where have we heard that? And that the principle of America is sacrifice for the public good. All of this is implied, if not explicitly stated, in Yoram Hazony's National Conservative Movement. But contrary to what Hazony may say about the American founders, Bradley Thompson is correct. In his book, America's Revolutionary Mind, and Rand is correct, the basic premise of the Founding Fathers was man's right to his own life, his own liberty, pursuit of his own happiness. You can't get away from the fact that that's what they meant. That means man's right to exist for his own sake, neither sacrificing himself to others nor sacrificing others to himself. This was their vision. Political implementation of this right is a society where men deal with another as traders to voluntary exchange to mutual benefit. So Rand writes the moral premises implicit in the political philosophy of the Founding Fathers, in the social system they established, in the economics of capitalism, must now be recognized, accepted as an explicit moral philosophy. That's the problem with the founders, is that they were not explicit enough. They were just coming to a knowledge of this. And that's why we did the Americanism book study 1 year ago. It's been that long since we did that. And so go back and find that, christianintellectual.com/Americanism. If anybody is not familiar with it, find the resources on what America is, the moral meaning of America. All right, well, we're in the last several pages. Any interactions on anything that I've just outlaid? Go ahead, Greg.
One of the key phrases that was mentioned was a perfect society. And it was something that's kind of mentioned in passing, but it did kind of remind me of the fact that, the word utopia, it's a Greek word that actually means like no place or nowhere. And apparently it's very similar to the Greek word for a good place. So it's, people talk about, society as it is and saying, well, we have all these problems in this quote unquote capitalist society. Therefore we need to throw out the whole thing and, bring in, Marxism or whatever ism the person happens to be selling, as if that's going to bring about utopia in America. And I mean, even if you did have a better system, it's still not going to be a utopia, so it's it's an interesting comparison that you see, made quite often, is whatever we have now compared to perfection. Therefore, here's this thing that I'm trying to sell.
Thank you for that. Any other interactions with the material today?
I just want to second what you said about pastors often being in the position of businessmen, as Rand describes it here. I think in many ways they can often become, in one way is that, they often are so occupied by the day-to-day work, or rather week-to-week work, they fail to set aside time to re-examine their philosophical foundations. Also, I think in many evangelical pastors I know, they tend to, in the same way that you might say Attila needs the stamp of approval from the witch doctor. I know so many pastors who you cannot reason with, you cannot persuade them to change their position on a topic unless you can say, here's this big name, here's this celebrity, this well-known platform who puts on conferences and owns a seminary or has a job at a seminary, whatever it is, to give the stamp of approval. And then they feel comfortable stepping into that, in making that doctrinal switch. And that sort of outsourcing of critical thought, getting all your ideas secondhand, or believing it privately but never actually letting it affect your work until you've been given permission by an endorsed source. That to me reeks of the kind of people she's criticizing here.
Amen to that. The big EVA movement, the conference movement, the author, pastor, speaker movement, they are attempting to be the new witch doctors. They're attempting to be the theologians of the court. They want to have the ability to speak to the presidents, speak to the cultural leaders, and their ideas, whatever they may be, are going to be what drives culture, what drives the churches. They see themselves as transmitting ideas, a channel of communication. And so wherever the evangelical elites are going, eventually churches are going to follow. We know that. We can see that just if you've been watching for 5 years. You can see that what they teach begins to be taught by the churches. What books they write begin to be sold by the churches. Yeah, I think that's a powerful connection, because everything that Rand has said here about the witch doctor and their relationship to Attila, that's similar to the relationship between the intellectuals today and the businessmen today, and it's similar to the relationship of Big Eva and the pastors today. I think that's the pattern.
I would fully endorse that, and I think as long as that Attila mentality continues to prevail, no new Luthers will arise from any kind of theological environment like that.
So I have to go in a minute, but I wanted to add that in general, the church as a whole functions as the quote-unquote intellectual in society. And obviously right now and for a long time has functioned as a witch doctor, as a wicked witch doctor in that capacity. And I have great compassion for the everyday, quote-unquote, practical man, the man represented by the businessman here in Rand's writing, or the man considered the producer. And when she talks about how the intellectuals have betrayed the businessmen, I feel a sense of personal responsibility as a Christian, because the church is supposed to be the intellectual protector of the everyday man, because the church is supposed to be the pillar and buttress of truth, providing salt and light for society, providing the foundation for producers to live and thrive. That's what the church is supposed to be. And so as a Christian, I feel that deep in my gut, that sense of betrayal, that the church has betrayed the everyday man, especially the producer, the moral man, the man designed to live on earth, the man who is trying to live out the Imago Dei, whether he realizes it or not. And the church is betraying that, is twisting it. I hate that. And that is what drove me in meeting with Cody to want to create for the new Christian intellectual, because of reading this book and seeing the great need and seeing the role of the church in this great historical drama and wanting to do whatever possible to reverse that. So that's my heart in this project. And as I'm rereading through this again, is I want the church to reclaim its rightful place as the intellectual protector of the producers in society, as the intellectual ally of the producers in society. So that's my goal and my prayer. I got to head out, guys. Thanks.
Thank you, Jacob. Jacob was speaking of the church being the intellectual protector of a moral society of producers. And that is what Rand is saying, that we must fight for the fact that it is morally right for men to produce. She says the new intellectuals must fight for capitalism, not as a, quote, practical issue, not as a economic issue, but with a moral righteous pride as a moral issue. That is what capitalism deserves. Nothing less will save it. So the goal of the new intellectuals must be, she writes, assume the task of building a new culture with a new moral foundation. And she points out that we have an advantage in this fight. We have reality on our side. The difficulties that we're going to encounter are not stone barriers, but fog, heavy fog of passive disintegration, she writes, through which it will be hard for them to find one another. Which is why we have intellectual resources to help people find each other. It's not that I know everything that's true and that everybody needs Cody Leibold, but it's that if I talk about these things that I think are true, then everybody that listens to our podcast can find each other in a community. They can find each other on Facebook or Twitter, however, and then they can get to know each other offline. So Rand writes, they will encounter no opposition, since in this context, an opposition would have to possess intellectual weapons. She writes, the process of identifying, judging, accepting, and upholding a new philosophy of life is a long, complicated process which requires thought, proof, full understanding, and conviction. But there are two principles on which all men of intellectual integrity and goodwill can agree as a basic minimum, as a precondition for any discussion, cooperation, or movement toward an intellectual renaissance. So, she's giving us the game plan. This is how you create a movement. Now, she's just given us the conditions. Or she's about to explain the conditions, the two conditions. And these are the conditions of people that I will associate with personally. These are conditions of people that I will want to have on my podcast, or that I want to be writing guest articles for me. People that I'll engage with in discussion and debate. The point here is that we have to be selective. Because if we are platforming and celebrating people that do not agree with these ideas, then we are eventually going to undermine any kind of movement toward a renaissance that we could create. So, we have to be willing to castigate, to criticize, to denigrate. We have to be willing to disagree, to disassociate. We have to ostracize some people. And this tells us the key. Because if you create a movement of people that believe these things, and that identifies this as the definition of the movement, then you'll create a movement that has power in it. So, the preconditions are: A, emotions are not tools of cognition. And in B, no man has the right to initiate the use of physical force against others. It's that simple. Emotions are not tools of cognition. No man has the right to initiate physical force against others. So this would immediately expel many of the traditional conservatives, all of the national conservatives. And it would expel those who are in the presuppositional movement and can't at least explain why they think that they're not being irrational. It doesn't mean that all of them are out, but if those presuppositionalists will say, we think that we are being rational, that's one thing. But if they equivocate and change the subject when you ask them about rationality, if you ask them, are you trying to be rational? Are you trying... That's how you distinguish between those who are in an honest error versus those who've actually made a moral failing. The moral failing would be to say, no, I feel it. My ancestors said it. I'm going to follow that because I feel it. blood and soil type. So keep in mind those two principles. One is cultural, one is epistemological. She writes, no discussion, cooperation, agreement, or understanding is possible among men who substitute emotion for proof. You have to at least attempt rationality. So we don't associate with people who substitute emotion for proof. What she's doing with that principle is she's rejecting the witch doctor's epistemology. And then with the other principle about rejecting initiation of physical force, she's rejecting the Attila's epistemology. That's why these two people are so helpful as a framework. So she writes, to claim the right to initiate physical force against another man, the right to compel his agreement by the threat of physical destruction, is to evict oneself automatically from the realm of rights and of morality of the intellect. Brute force and somebody's sacrifice as a normal, necessary part of human society is an idea that we have to reject. On the last couple of pages now, we need to carefully note here that the Attilaists and the witch doctors cannot conceive of selfishness except in terms of sacrificing others to oneself. They cannot conceive of anyone who does not regard such sacrificing as to his own interest. This, of course, is a psychological confession about the nature of their own desires, about the Attila in their souls. This is how you argue with them, is you say, do you really think that it's in your interest to pillage other people? Is that when you say that self-interest and my whole rational egoism idea is wrong, are you actually saying that you think self-interest requires you to do these wicked things? Is that really what you think is good for you? It's a discussion about what's really good and evil, and so it's a discussion that has weighty, weighty stakes. Rand writes, so long as men believe that the initiation of physical force by some men against others is a proper part of an organized society, hatred, violence, brutality, destruction, and slaughter, savage gang warfare of group against group are all that they can or will achieve. When physical force is the ultimate arbiter, men are driven to connive, conspire, gang up on one another in order to destroy rather than be destroyed. The best perish, but the Attilas rise to the top. That's the explanation for why you can't have rule by force, rule by initiation of force, I should say. If that is the standard, then it's just a fight over who gets to hold the biggest sword. So Rand is wrapping up her section. She says, let no man posture as an advocate of peace if he proposes or supports any social system that initiates the use of physical force against individual men in any form whatever. And she, of course, notes you do have the right to use physical force in self-defense, but she's talking about initiation. She writes, let no man posture as an intellectual if he proposes to elevate a thug into the position of final authority over the intellect, or if he equates the power of physical compulsion with the power of persuasion. She writes, no advocate of reason can claim the right to force his ideas on others. Now, in that sentence, it's a very potent sentence because she's drawing a connection between these two principles. The life of the mind, and then also the initiation of physical force. They're incompatible with each other. And that's why Attila is broken. That's why the witch doctor is broken. No advocate of the free mind can claim the right to force the minds of others. That's the sin of the witch doctor, is the claim that he can use the Attila to force the minds of others.
Just a word on that. I've often thought of that when reading the passage in which Jesus tells his disciples, sends them out 2 by 2, and says, if a village does not listen to you, take out your sword. No, he doesn't say take out your sword. He says take off your sandal, knock the dust off your sandals, and keep walking. That was a radical departure from most attempts at persuading others to join a religion in the past. That I believe is a fundamental that's an underutilized passage when we talk about coercion and the use of force or even just societal pressure, however someone wants to define it, when it comes to religious liberty, and that's just a fundamental distinction between Christianity and many other religions, or even other ideologies.
I agree. And that brings us to a problem with the theonomist views that we hear talked about today. Go ahead, Greg.
So the significance of shaking the dust off your sandals, I kind of always suspected there's probably a cultural significance to that, or there's probably more to it. Like my understanding in the Middle East is if you hit somebody on the head with your sandal, that's supposed to be, a very high insult.
Yeah, I don't know all of the context, but I do know that everybody had the dust on their feet in those days. And so it's basically saying, I don't want to carry your town with me.
And also, I think, a form of judgment in the sense of this area will eventually suffer the consequences of their own rejection of this message. And therefore, I don't want to be near it. I'm not taking any part of you with me because you're on your own now. And I think even in there, you have the sense of you have a responsibility to experience both the rewards and consequences of your beliefs.
You compare that idea to what Rand described earlier about the moral system that says do not judge. They are opposites. Part of the Christian message requires that we judge, at least judge the fruits. And I think that is part of the weakness within Christianity right now, is this unwillingness to castigate, unwillingness to draw moral lines. All right, well, we'll wrap up the reading. So Rand writes, no rational society, no cooperation, no agreement, no understanding, no discussion are possible among men who propose to substitute guns for rational persuasion. And so there are her two premises. Emotions are not our source of truth, and guns and force are not our means of creating a better society. They must be put under strict control. Force should only be used against those who initiate force. The government should not be an agent of initiating force. And for that reason, we have all these implications. There should not be a draft. There should not be income tax. There should not be entitlement programs. There should not be the regulatory state that we have today. All these different things. And you can see that if you want more details, go to our Objectivism book study or our Americanism book study. But what Rand has given us here is sort of a capstone on the work that we've already done. And the capstone tells us, if you want to create a movement that's going to promote the truth that matters here, the movement is going to have to be based on those two principles. And those are hard principles. It's going to cause conflict. But I do endorse them. All right, well, I'm going to go to the concluding section here. I just wanted to invite anybody that wants to continue to discuss this with us to go to christianintellectual.com/intellectual. And that's where we have all the replays of these, and that's where you can sign up and get all the details. We are going to take 2 weeks off, so next Saturday and the following, we're not meeting. But we are going to meet on October 29th, and then we're going to also meet on the November 5th, 12th, and 19th. It'll be 4 weeks in a row, and in those weeks we're going to discuss the character speeches in some of Ayn Rand's fiction, including some very short speeches and Howard Rourke's Courtroom, and the early and late Atlas Shrugged speeches, but not Galt's speech. That'll be for another time. Please consider supporting for the New Christian Intellectual. Please consider becoming a regular donor, and to set that up, you can go to christianintellectual.com/Patreon. We are equipping Christians to be defenders of reason, individualism, and capitalism. Through this work, we are aiming to create a new American Renaissance. Thank you for joining us in this meeting of the New Intellectual Book Study. Give this a like, give this a share, it helps us out, and find us at christianintellectual.com. I look forward to talking with you again. God bless.